Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 231. The Shooting at the Opera House. Part 2. After the tragedy, Amy was discharged from the Melbourne Hospital on the 7th of September 1880, and she left the institution in a cab in company with her late husband's relative, R.S. Anderson and Mrs. Anderson. John's grandfather and Robert Anderson were half-brothers. R.S. Anderson was a native of Ireland. He was born in Londonderry. His full name was Robert Sterling Anderson. He graduated in Trinity College, Dublin, and practised for 8 years in Ireland as a solicitor. He married Miss Cockburn, the daughter of Major Cockburn, in Ireland. In 1854, then being 33 years of age, he came to Australia, at first going to Adelaide. He intended to stay there but changed his mind, and upon arrival he proceeded to Melbourne. He was elected to the Assembly in 1855. He was Commissioner of Customs and held portfolios in various administrations. He died in October 1883 at his home in Kew, Melbourne. In the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate on the 14th of September 1880. The Telegraph says that on Tuesday morning at a comparative early hour, Mrs. Greer left the Melbourne Hospital in company with several lady friends and proceeded to the steamship Chimborazo, lying off the railway pier, with the intention of embarking for the voyage home, her berth having been taken in her maiden name. But on arrival alongside, the captain of the Chimborazo, learning who his would-be passenger was, declined to allow her to proceed on the voyage. Several of the passengers intimated to the captain they did not offer any objection to Mrs. Greer accompanying them, but he persisted in his refusal to allow her to go on board. Mrs. Greer was then removed by her friends and conveyed to private lodgings, pending other arrangements. The Victorian friends of the deceased Mr. Greer have adopted the child. And another article says Mrs. Greer is to be forwarded to England, the friends of her late husband having generously undertaken to provide the means to send her from the colony. She was initially put on board the SS Potosi, but from unavoidable circumstances her departure was postponed. In Melbourne on the 18th of September, it says the mail steamer Bangalore cleared at 1 o'clock. On Wednesday, she had very few passengers, but it's believed that Mrs. Greer is on board. Amy is listed as living at Somerset in England in 1881 with the Potter family, and it states that she is a visitor in their home at the time of the census. The Potter family were born in the same area of Somerset as Amy was. I lose track of Amy at that point, so it's quite possible that she remarried at some stage, but family trees do not indicate that they've been able to find a death record or any further marriage records for Amy. All I could find on some trees was a reference that she died in Russia. And a little on John and Amy's son. Robert Paul D'Orsif Patrick Greer, as mentioned in Part 1, was born on the 26th of February 1879 at Hillsborough in Ireland. He was 17 months old when the tragedy occurred. He was adopted by Mr. Spencer Smith, a resident of Warrnambool, who educated and treated him well. Due to his delinquent behaviour and stealing as a young child from his foster family and the extended family of the foster family. In the Sydney Evening News on the 1st of June 1896, a youth named Robert Greer, 17 years of age, has been arrested at Warrnambool on a charge of housebreaking and stealing. On Saturday last, the residence of Mr. George Greening was broken into and a lady's gold chain, gold studs and numerous other articles were stolen. Suspicion rested upon Greer, and when interviewed by Constable Day, he admitted having committed the robbery and pointed out the place where the articles were hidden. He was arrested and has been remanded until Friday. The accused is the son of Mr. and Mrs. Greer, who were the principals in a sensational tragedy that occurred at the Melbourne Opera House 16 years ago. Greer shot his wife and her supposed paramour, a Frenchman named Soudry, and then shot himself. Greer died from the effects of the wounds, but Mrs. Greer and Soudry recovered. Greer's only child was adopted. He was sent back to the Greer family in Ireland. However, he returned to Australia on the ship the Nineveh in 1898 when he was 19.
The first we see of Robert Greer is in 1899 as a 20-year-old. He was charged on the 1st of March 1899 with being drunk and disorderly and resisting police in Adelaide. He was fined 10 shillings or 3 days imprisonment. He paid the fine. On the 4th of May 1899 in the Bendigo Independent, a woman's sin, the Greer-Soudry tragedy, revived. A young man named Robert Greer was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment at the Warrnambool Police Court on Tuesday for stealing a gold chain, a brooch and a packet of arsenic. The accused is a son of Greer, who was the principal in a tragedy which was enacted at the Opera House, Melbourne, 19 years ago. He was adopted by a resident at Warrnambool, but from his boyhood he's been in trouble. His solicitor stated that he was a kleptomaniac, for he invariably robbed his foster parents and their relatives. About 2 years ago, Greer was sent to his father's relatives in Ireland, but his sojourn there was brief, and he was next heard of at Malta, having enlisted in a regiment. He returned to Australia on the Nineveh in 1898. 2 months ago, he turned up at Warrnambool and soon got into trouble by stealing jewellery belonging to the relatives of his foster parents, for which he will have to serve 6 months in the Geelong jail. In Sydney on the 14th of February 1900 for receiving, and he received 18 months hard labour. He was 23 and his occupation was listed as a piano tuner in the Central Police Court. There were 4 involved in the burglary where they broke and entered into the dwelling house of Jim Hong Gu. On the 15th of February 1900, it said that the 4 involved pled not guilty to the charge. The charge was for stealing a large quantity of property, including jewellery, clothing and tools, the property of Jimmy Young and R. Sam. There was a second count of receiving. Mr. Henderson appeared for Diorsi, but the others were undefended. The 3 men were seen carrying 2 boxes containing much of the property into a boarding house from a cab. Some of the missing property was found at Diorsi's abode. Diorsi stated that he had been asked to assist Lyndon and Mason and another man in carrying some boxes like those stolen. However, he knew nothing of the theft. The jury returned a verdict of stealing against Lyndon and Mason and of receiving against Diorsi and Sue. And then on the 13th of September 1901, for burglary and larceny, he received 5 years hard labour. And the 4 years hard labour and 5 years hard labour were to be served concurrently. He was convicted under the name Robert Darcy Greer, but was also known as Robert Diorsi. Some details of those misdemeanours in Sydney in the Australian Star on the 5th of September 1901. House robberies. Robert Darcy Greer, 27, and Walter Holmes, 26, on remand from Glebe, were charged at the Newtown Court yesterday with breaking and entering the dwelling of John McNichol at Marrickville and stealing a gold muff chain, a gold ring, 2 pairs of gold sleeve links, a silver pencil case, a silver matchbox, a Macintosh cape, a pair of opera glasses, a gold-mounted greenstone, a pair of gloves, silk handkerchiefs and a manicure set, all valued at £18. Detective Fullerton said that about 10 a.m. on Tuesday, while the 2 accused were at Glebe Police Station, he charged them with stealing the articles mentioned and put them in a cell with 3 other men and told them they were there for identification by a Chinaman named R. Try, who bought the jewellery. R. Try immediately picked out the 2 accused. Holmes made no reply and Greer said, "You have been fencing a long time, Charlie." R. Try, jewellery dealer, said he knew the accused and had bought jewellery from them. They'd been to his shop 4 times. Mrs. McNichol identified the articles as her husband's that had been stolen from the house which had been broken into. On the 14th of September 1901 in the Sydney Australian Star. Housebreakers sentenced. It passes my comprehension why 2 young men in the enjoyment of health and strength should engage in such sneaking petty thefts and in the more serious offence of housebreaking, said Judge Fitzherding, addressing himself to Walter Holmes and Robert Greer, 2 strapping young fellows who came before him for sentence yesterday afternoon at the Darlinghurst Sessions. There was a whole string of charges against the prisoners, both of whom had been exploiting the suburbs for some time past. His Honour, after expressing a hope that the sentence he intended to pass would be a deterrent, not only to the prisoners but to others also, ordered each of them to undergo 5 years of penal servitude. Robert was released from the Parramatta Jail on the 7th of June 1905. At the time of his release, it stated that he was an accountant, 5'11" in height, fair skin, dark brown hair and brown eyes. On the 24th of June 1905, Robert Darcy Greer, alias Diorcy, 26, was committed for trial at the Water Court yesterday on a charge of stealing from the dwelling house of Janet Godfrey various articles valued at £6.10, the property of William Davidson. Bail was allowed. On the 9th of August in the Sydney Evening News. Young man on the downgrade, no excuse for crime. Robert Darcy Greer, who'd been convicted at the Darlinghurst Sessions of stealing in a dwelling, was brought up for sentence before Judge Docker today. The prisoner, who's only 26 and a half years of age and a well-educated man, was sentenced to 18 months hard labour at the Central Criminal Court in 1900 for receiving stolen property. On the 10th of September 1901, he received 4 years hard labour on each of 3 charges of housebreaking and stealing, the sentences to be concurrent. 3 days later, he was sentenced to 4 years hard labour on each of the 2 charges of housebreaking and stealing, and on the same day he received 5 years hard labour on a charge of larceny, to be concurrent with the previous sentences. His sentences on 2 appearances at the court within 4 days aggregated to 25 years, but being concurrent, he only had to serve 5 years. His Honour, after the prisoner had protested his innocence, said that on the evidence the jury were quite satisfied in concluding that you stole the portmanteau and its contents, especially as there was no evidence to contradict that on behalf of the Crown. It appeared that the prisoner got lodging in this particular house and he disappeared, owing money for his board and taking with him some of the other lodgers' property. No doubt it was very hard for persons who had been convicted of a crime to obtain employment, but that was no excuse for crime. The only thing to do with such persons was to keep them away from the chance of committing crime. His Honour, having read a statement handed in by the accused, asked, "Am I to understand from your statement that you still say that you are not guilty?" "Yes," answered the accused, "I cannot say anything else." His Honour said, "You have served a long sentence, young as you are, and you are not long out after serving a sentence. You say in your statement that you were disappointed on not getting money to leave the country, and you state that you not only had the money which you earned in jail. The sentence of 5 years of which you received ought to have been sufficient to deter you from committing further crime, but it appears that it is not." The prisoner was sentenced to 2 years hard labour in Parramatta Jail, His Honour declining to accede to a request for a reduction of the sentence by a month. Robert was released from jail on the 22nd of April 1907. On the 9th of September 1907, in the Albury Border Morning Mail and Riverina Times, housebreaking at Wodonga. Robert Paul Greer was before the Albury Police Court on Friday, charged with breaking and entering the dwelling of Philip Valentine Frauenfelder at Wodonga on the 18th of July, stealing a gold watch and other articles. Senior Sergeant Brown said that at 2:45 in the afternoon on Thursday, he was in company with Constable Cooper of Albury and Constable Toohill of Wodonga when he arrested the accused in Dean Street. When asked whether he'd tried to sell the watch, the accused replied that he had and that he'd purchased it off a man in Bambrick's Hotel in Wodonga for 10 shillings. He also admitted having endeavoured to sell the watch to a Hindu 5 or 6 weeks ago. The witness produced pieces of a watch chain which were found on the accused. A remand to Wodonga was granted. And on the 12th of October 1907, in the Beechworth Ovens and Murray Advertiser, Robert Paul Greer, who pleaded guilty to larceny in a dwelling and admitted to a number of previous convictions, pleaded that he was not sober when he committed the offence. His Honour said he must remember what prisoner's previous career had been, and he was an old offender, and he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment with hard labour. It stated that Robert Paul Greer was employed at Miss Stones's Courthouse Hotel in Albury as a groom. In his Victorian jail record from his misdemeanour at Beechworth in 1907, interestingly it states that he's married. His wife is Mrs. Greer, living at Rutherglen. He was transferred from Beechworth Jail to Pentridge, and then he was free by remand on the 21st of January 1910. Robert married Ida Edith Boddington on the 31st of December 1912 in Rockdale, New South Wales. He was 33 and Ida 24. He stated he was a clerk at the time of their marriage and stated that he was born in Portland. Also on the marriage certificate it says his father was John James McGregor Greer, who was a bank clerk, and his mother Amy Diorcy. He did not state that his father was deceased. They had 3 children together, one being before they married and one after he served in World War I. Robert enlisted in World War I under the name of Robert Paul Greer on the 15th of October 1917. He stated that he was a shorthand writer clerk. He served in Egypt and returned on the 30th of August 1919. Robert was employed in the railways from the 6th of June 1912. He listed his full name as Robert Paul D'Orsay Patrick Greer. He wrote that he was born on the 26th of February 1879. By the 19th of October 1914, he was employed as a clerk, and he resigned from his position in the railways on the 13th of January 1923. He purchased land at Gunnedah under the Soldier Settlement Scheme on the 10th of January 1923. On the 2nd of January 1924 in the New South Wales Police Gazette, Robert Paul Greer, 44, charged with stealing the sum of £13, 16 shillings and 1 pence, the property of Marcus John Alexander Oliver and Dally George Tryon Oliver, trading as Oliver Brothers, has been arrested by Constables Purdon, Adams and Madison at Gunnedah Police, committed for trial at the Gunnedah Sessions, identical with discharged prisoner Robert Darcy Greer, alias Robert D'Orsay, alias Robert D'Orsay Greer. So he went to court at the Gunnedah Quarter Sessions on the 11th of April 1924 and was acquitted. On the 16th of August 1930 in the Sydney Morning Herald, Farming Partnership, Boddington versus Greer. In default of the defendant's appearance, a decree was made in the suit by Harry Alfred Boddington of Emerald Hill against Robert Paul Greer. Harry Boddington was Robert's brother-in-law, so Ida's brother, arising out of a partnership dispute in respect of contiguous farms, one of which was at Urelba at Emerald Hill. The plaintiff declared that he and Greer agreed in January 1923 to work their respective farms on equal shares. The defendant kept the books and dealt with the financial side of the business, while the plaintiff did the general work on the farm. Plaintiff alleged that the defendant had not paid him his share of the partnership profits and refused to show him the accounts so that he could ascertain the position of the partnership. Consequently, in 1929, the partnership was determined by mutual consent, but defendant had not accounted to the plaintiff for his half share of the profits and assets of the business. In the correspondence in connection with the suit, the defendant declared that he and the plaintiff were on soldiers' blocks, which were too small for any monetary success, and that the defendant's liabilities exceeded £2,000, some of which he alleged were contracted by the plaintiff, and for which he refused to accept responsibility. He stated further that there was no partnership but merely a verbal understanding, and that full accounts were handed to the plaintiff frequently. His Honour made a decree, but the question of costs was reserved. So on the 10th of March 1933, in the Government Gazette, in the Land District of Gunnedah, in the Liverpool Plains Shire, under the Urelba Settlement Purchase Area, 564 acres, forfeited from Robert Paul Greer. In the New South Wales records, it says that Robert Paul Greer transferred his soldier settlement at Gunnedah on the 3rd of April 1935 to Walter Trevethan. Robert died in 1965 in Gosford at the age of 86. And it seems after his marriage that he went on the straight and narrow. Who was Monsieur A.M. Louis Soudry? Well, we know that he held several positions of trust under the French government, and he was brought out for the exhibitions of Philadelphia, Sydney and Melbourne, being on the French Commission. He was 32, so he was born in 1848. On the 29th of October 1880 in the Perth West Australian, says, "My sympathies are with the gallant French, including M. Soudry, who, by the way, although considerably powder-marked about the cheek, has otherwise quite recovered from the effects of his recent disagreeable attack. I overheard an artist at canvassing the other day saying that he always presented his pipe case to M. Soudry with an ominous click when applying for any favour, the said favour being immediately granted, but I doubt the truth of this." On the 5th of August 1880, Monsieur Soudry left the Melbourne hospital today. He'll be quite recovered in about a week, but a scar still remains on his cheek. He expressed himself grateful for the treatment he received in the institution. He had no interview with Mrs. Greer and would not have been allowed one had if he sought it. And on the 2nd of August 1880, in the Launceston Examiner in Tasmania, M. Soudry and the French inhabitants. The late shooting case at the Melbourne Opera House has, says the Herald, called forth an expression of opinion that Monsieur Soudry, who was the prime cause as disturber of peace between the young couple, which led up to a triple attempt at murder, should at once resign his responsible and representative position as commissioner to take charge of the French government exhibits at the forthcoming Melbourne International Exhibition. The leading Frenchmen here say that Monsieur Soudry is not worthy to remain in the colony longer as representative of the Great Republic, and they view his conduct with utter disgust. As a private individual, of course, there is nothing extraordinary in the fact that Monsieur Soudry is a Frenchman, but it's not advisable to have a physically and morally disfigured person representing a great nation in an official capacity at an international exhibition, and to be continually an object of curiosity to visitors, on each occasion recalling his conduct which led up to the terrible tragedy. On the 9th of August 1888, it said Soudry ran his fascinating shape in the exhibition for some time afterwards the tragedy, and was marked by the special admiration of ladies who delight in heroes. He finally sailed for the fair land of France after, it is said, cleaning out some of the cutest gamblers who adorn this city. On the 30th of December 1911, there was a recollection of the event, and it said that France had made a characteristic display of articles de Paris, and the Department of Beaux Arts was one of the best in the Melbourne exhibition. It was controlled by Monsieur Soudry, a cheerful, good-looking Frenchman, a perfect type of boulevardier. Soudry, after a few weeks in hospital, turned up at the exhibition but was recalled by his government. He suffered forever after from a nervous twitching. On the 7th of December 1880, in the Gundagai Times and Tumut and Adelong and Murrumbidgee District Advertiser, Monsieur Soudry is a great draw for the French court at the Melbourne International. About 2,500 people daily accost him with the entreaty, "Could you please show us Mr. Soudry?" And when that hero replies, "C'est moi," 2,499 out of the 2,500 walk away disappointed. On the 5th of December 1953 in the Melbourne Herald, it had a recollection of the night that Death at the Opera panicked an audience. It says, terror gripped the audience at the Melbourne Opera House 73 years ago. It struck as the curtain had dropped on the act that predicted disaster in the next, and when the murmur of applause from the social elite of colonial Melbourne was rising above the last bars of the orchestra's finale. Bejewelled ladies and beribboned gentlemen, the assembled beauty and chivalry of many lands, were stunned when suddenly they saw a flash of a silver pistol, heard the shots, and felled a pretty woman and a high representative of France before the furious and unhappy gunman committed suicide in the Isles. The tragedy, probably unique in the theatrical history of Australia, occurred on the night of the 24th of July 1880 at the Bourke Street Opera House where the Tivoli now stands. It was a year of festivals when the power and prosperity of the empire were almost at their peak. Meyerbeer's opera, the Huguenot, was being played at the fashionable opera house by Verdi and Bohème and Hersey. The theatre was packed by wealthy colonials and officials from many nations who had been accredited to Melbourne to attend the mighty exhibition, which was to be opened soon in the great domed building, which still presides over the northeast sector of the city. Amongst them was Monsieur Louis Soudry, one-time linen draper and former Commissioner of Fine Arts at the Philadelphia and Sydney exhibitions, who'd recently arrived in Melbourne as a delegate for France. Soudry was in his early 30s and had landed on the steamer Garonne only 6 days before. He'd been a first-class passenger, but shipboard travellers later swore that he'd spent much more time in the second-class quarters than the first class. Amongst the second-class passengers were John James McGregor Greer, fresh-complexioned, broad-shouldered, 27-year-old son of a Presbyterian clergyman in Ireland, and his beautiful but somewhat dull-eyed 20-year-old wife and their 18-month-old son. Greer, formerly employed by the Ulster Bank of Dublin, had emigrated to improve his position and had accepted a position at the Melbourne Commercial Bank. His wife, of French extraction, had been born in England and spoke French fluently. Perhaps if Greer had understood French, the tragedy that was to unfold that night might have been averted. At least if he could have followed the spirited conversations between his wife and Soudry, he might have anticipated the blatant romance at sea that soon inflamed his hatred for the Frenchman. The Greers stayed at Belmont House in Drummond Street, Carlton, and were among 400 theatre enthusiasts who packed the dress circle of the Opera House on the evening of Saturday, July 24th. Dapper, vivacious Soudry, and a M. Gregory Burke had seats nearer the centre of the circle but exchanged no signs of recognition with the Greers. As the curtain dropped at the end of the fourth act, the audience was keenly anticipating the last scene of the opera, the massacre of Huguenots. Greer was an almost abstemious man, but like many others, that might be an advantage of the brief interval to stretch his legs and walk to the nearby bar. He was returning to his seat a few minutes later when he noticed that Soudry had left his row and was chatting animatedly with his wife. Greer walked to the opposite side of the dress circle, watched the couple for a few seconds, and then, as something in his tormented brain snapped, strode quickly through the crowd towards them. The patrons around did not notice Greer's compressed lips and his white taut face. They saw his arm move and thought that he intended to shake the hand of the Frenchman, rising gallantly from the seat. They were horrified when they saw the flash of a nickel-plated pistol and heard 2 loud reports. The first of the 7mm bullets fired point-blank, smashing into Soudry's face. It exited his right cheek and emerged at the back of his neck and disfigured his face for life. The second bullet struck Mrs. Greer below the right ear and passed through her throat and mouth. As the couple slumped in their seats, Greer fired a third shot at Burke, for reasons not known, and began to walk towards the stairs. He'd taken only 10 paces when he pressed the pistol against his head and pulled the trigger. Women screamed and men shouted and stampeded, and Greer collapsed in the aisle, saying, "I am very weak." There was a panic-stricken crowd. Vainly and frenzily, the orchestra played hard with fiddle and flute to drown out the screams and soothe the audience's tears. About 30 of the diehards in the audience, determined to set an example to the hysteria, nervously resumed their seats when the curtain rose again. The curtain rose jerkily and commenced the scene of a massacre of the Huguenots, and as the first stage shots that were fired to kill the Huguenots echoed around the theatre, even the most strong-willed and stalwart abandoned their seats and fled. Some fainted before they reached the doors, and several tumbled down the stairs. Others crawled under their seats, and many were dragged from their escorts and plunged into the swirl of people before the back stalls and the street. Many minutes passed before theatre attendants and police, called from every city beat, could restore order in the gaslit streets and take Soudry and the Greers to hospital. Greer, who had a bullet at the base of the brain, died without rallying. His beautiful wife, who was open with her liaison, later left the capital without inquiring about her husband. She was never heard of again. And Monsieur Soudry, he was banished from office and he was put out of public life forever. So I hope you enjoyed the story of the shooting at the Opera House in Melbourne in 1880, a story that I had never heard before, so it was very interesting to research.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.